Why do startup founders often underestimate competition?
So you see, I'm unique, and then I move on to the next slide.
If you're disclosing the information, right, that does not build the trust between the startup founder and the investor.
When talking to Ukrainian founders, we hear cost. And that's a red flag for investors right there.
We analyzed the competitive environment, and we didn't find a gorilla. We found 3 gorillas.
Trying to figure out what they're best at and try to outperform them.
Persistence, because that's key, for startup.
So I want to talk about the competition, because a lot of the Ukrainian startup founders, they just either skip that slide or show, a generic table with how much better they are, with all the green checks. And then all the competitors have all these red boxes. And then you're trying to figure out, why don't you sell all the world, and why are these competitors even there if they have all the red, dots and nothing green's ever there? So let's talk about why do startup founders often underestimate competition, and why don't they take into consideration that there is a lot to learn about competition? Why is it so important to know your competitors and to learn from them, not just, avoid them or beat them, obviously, but you have to learn from them. They're in a lot of ways smarter than you are.
I thought about that a lot, because, you talk about you never hear about this and you always hear about this. I've seen 200 presentations, maybe more. They all have a matrix. There's me and 4 competitors. There's 5 attributes that matter. Every one of the competitors has 2 or 3 checks. I have all 5 checks. So you see, I'm unique, and then I move on to the next slide. One thing that makes me extremely angry is then I go home and I spend 2 hours doing research on competitors in this particular field. The first thing that I find out is there are not 5, there are 20, and 10 of them are in China. Okay, that's number one. Number 2, I look at all of the competitors who started their business at about the same time that this company did. And what I find is the company asking for investment has 20 employees, they have 200. The company asking for investment has $3 or $4 million in revenue they've achieved, the others have 20. So I step back and say, starting at about the same time with similar technology, trying to serve the same customer sets, but let's see what these people did. Let's see how did they do it. Let's see, to the extent we can find out, you can't always because the research is tough, but there's a trick. Are there very smart things that we could do? And the trick is just interview customers. Because the customers out there are not buying just from you. They're buying from competitor 1, 2, 3, 17, and 20. So just as there is a huge opportunity to learn about this world called customer world, but the second thing is, so how do I outcompete them by focusing on areas of the market or types of customers where I can create an advantage that they don't have? That's the kind of conversation the investor wants to know. They'll say, Ivan and Natalia, you're a team, okay? You're a team from Singapore, and you're a team that's going to build a business in financial services or whatever it might be that will be 7 or 8 times more cost effective, and you're going to enter the market in September. Okay, what are we going to do? And in fact, this has actually happened to hundreds of startups who kind of did not anticipate the entry of AI into their business and are now scrambling to try to catch up. We're going to expect somebody to get into our business in 6 to 9 months. So we have to make sure that our trajectory of customer improvement is so steep that they will regret ever having entered our business. That's a very different conversation than 3 green checks versus 5 green checks.
Yeah, I've seen those tables way too often. I don't like them, but if you choose that way to present your competition, explain it very well. What is it that makes you stand out? And I ask often that question, so what is your competitive advantage? What is your competitive edge? And often, I have to say that, when talking to Ukrainian founders, we hear cost. And that's a red flag for investors right there. If you hear that your primary competitive advantage hinges on cost, then it's easy to beat. Then somebody else will enter that market quickly and it'll become a commodity market. Another one that I would say, if it's a very crowded market, that's already another red flag for the investors. And, another tip, if you strive to be like one of your competitors, but in a slightly different segment or niche, it might be helpful to show the investors how did they reach that point. And I also, unfortunately, had situations when people did not disclose some of their most prominent competitors.
Yep.
Do not do that because it comes out. Yeah. It comes out in due diligence and then it doesn't reflect well on you. Yeah. So that would be my other piece of advice. Be thorough on this topic because, for investors, it's important to know if there is a company that's doing precisely like you, why would we be investing in your startup?
It's what you, Adriana, always tell us, right? Don't be afraid of your competitors. Know them well, learn everything about them, and then tell us investors what are they best at and things that you're going to learn from them and things that you can take and improve. Otherwise, if you're disclosing the information, right, that does not build the trust between you and the startup, between the startup founder and the investor.
Look, everybody, I think, is, after several years now, comfortable with the idea of pivot, okay? We developed our minimum viable product, we tried it, the customers didn't like it or it didn't work and we had to pivot because there wasn't a response. We analyzed the competitive environment and we didn't find a gorilla. We found 3 gorillas, okay? And we couldn't figure out a way that we could outcompete them in any subsegment or niche of the market. So we thought things through and decided to go in this direction because for some of these markets, these competitors would not be interested.
For me, seeing that matrix that we just discussed is always like, it's not a red flag, but it's something radish that I see because I think, okay, now they're going to start, talking about that wishful thinking, trying to convince themselves, although in many times startup founders did convince themselves already that they are the most unique and the best ones because they have all the green boxes and they can just run and try to implement all these green boxes. And then you ask okay, if the other competitors who don't have all of them just have one green box and they're good at it, maybe the rest 3 or 4, whatever, are not necessary. Maybe the market does not need them. And again, as I started, in many ways, I think that founders tend to convince themselves that's where I'm going to go, instead of analyzing their competitors and trying to figure out what they're best at and try to outperform them in a certain industry or in certain tech or in certain business model.
One more tip that I want to say, because I often like to ask entrepreneur, what are the risk factors? What are the risk factors that you're going to fail? And a good question that gives us probe on the competition is, what are the risk factors that your competition is going to outperform you? And that's when asking that question, that's where a lot of information comes out and analysis, how you think about your competition. So that's a good question to keep in mind.
Absolutely.
As you go throughout your presentation in general, but in competition.
Or to rephrase it, and I heard it from you, Adrian, I think, is give me one reason why you're going to lose.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Just something like a, brain work, brain game. Just, okay, think about it.
Yeah. There are 2 interesting connections. The most important things tend to be not quantified. How much value do we add to the customer? How much better is it than it was 6 months ago? The lack of quantification on the customer side is usually a signal that we maybe don't know them that well. The most value I've ever added for a lot of clients is to come back and say, This is how your customers ranked your number one competitor, who is 10 times smaller than you are, your number two competitor, who is 4 times smaller than you are, and you. And you can find that out. When you're looking at who are the competitors that I should be most worried about, go to the customer and say, how do you rate them and me on providing this offer to you? It's an eye-opener. It's real data. And it has a very, very useful kicker. Because if you're having, and this actually happened to me several times, we once went to Intel to do something for a chemical company. And it was clear at the end of the meeting that there was zero opportunity for the client to serve them. And then as we were walking out the door, the client said, not the client, the Intel said, but wait a second. Let me tell you what our real problem is. And then another hour and a half meeting on what the real problem is, managing chemicals and waste disposals in the factory, which was a business that was dominated by nobody and was an open opportunity for this company. So it forces you back to the customer. Not every meeting ends that happily, but that's okay. So it gives you a sense of where you've lost the battle already, where you might be able to win, but do you have the money to, outrun the other 39 search companies? Because there are 40 search companies before Google, Yahoo, and Bing ended up with them. But do you have the money to outrun Google or Yahoo? But those kinds of conversations with customers often lead to, don't look here, this battle is lost. But we're begging somebody to solve this set of problems for us.
I think in a lot of ways we see that. Many startup founders, they tend to get into the trap of the survival's error, where they think that I'm gonna make it. I don't have to be customer obsessed because, okay, there are some companies, some great companies that never did any customer development. They just hit the target, they hit their customer, and the product went off with their sales. And then a lot want to think that I'm gonna be the one. I'm gonna be the second one, the third one that will hit the target, that will hit the sales, and I don't need to do the customer development. But the statistics says that only 0.0001 whatever percent can do that. Otherwise, you have to be customer obsessed.
Oh, it's absolutely correct. But the first thing you have to have as a successful founder, you have to be persistent as hell. You have to think that.
Tell me what do you mean by successful founder?
Well, the successful founder who grows a successful business, right? That has, how do you define success? I think we're getting into a philosophical question here. But in a startup, for the investor, what's a successful startup? It's a startup that basically grows 60-70% annually, because only with that growth does the venture capital then ultimately has a chance of doing 10, 10, 10. And that's the magic formula for VCs. And when you talk to successful VCs, typically if they invest in 9 or 10, and it's consistent, it's actually amazing, but that formula is consistent for successful VCs. Only 1 out of 9 or 1 of 10 becomes a superstar, right? Superstar, we're talking about 60, 70 growth year to year for the next 10 years, right? It could be vary between years, but ultimately, on average, 60, 70%. 4 of those 9 fail completely. They go out of business. 4 return you the capital, maybe with a small, 5, 6%, they're doing okay, something like that.
I mean, you still lose, but not that much.
So VCs always, when they make the investment, they look for that outlier, for that star that will bring them to that 10, 10, 10 formula, right? So the successful business, when you pitch to VCs, should be the one where you can show that year to year you can grow your revenues 60, 70%. And that's another trap that we often see with Ukrainian startups. they show small scale. But going back to persistence, because that's key, for startup, for entrepreneurs.
Oh, it is. It is.
Being entrepreneur is very tough. Okay, building a business is difficult, especially in the first 2-3 years. It's the feeling that you always like push the ball up the hill. And you have to persevere in the face of difficulties.
It is insane for me to not understand customer world, okay? Because customer ignorance is one of the biggest risks for me to build something great. Number 3, if somebody in the organization isn't worried about sales or distribution, okay, we will never get to 60 to 70%, because the way 60 to 70% happens is those wins in the first 2 to 3 years who buy more and recommend more. I have to deliver 60 to 70% growth because that's the only way their business works.